Hi, thank you so much for taking a look. I have some exciting news to share with you. In 1980, I wrote a book called Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy. It was about a new treatment for depression called cognitive therapy. It's a big word, but had a simple meaning. It just means that our feelings are created by our thoughts and not by what's happening. That idea goes back 2,000 years to the Greek philosopher Epictetus, who said people are disturbed not by things, not by experiences, but by our views of them. And the idea was when you're depressed and anxious, you're giving yourself a lot of distorted, irrational, unreasonable messages that depression and anxiety are the oldest cons. You're telling yourself things that aren't true. The thoughts like, I'm no good, I'm a loser, I'm hopeless, I'll never get better, or whatever you're telling yourself contain distortions like all or nothing thinking and overgeneralizations and should statements and self-blame and emotional reasoning and many others. And the cool thing is when you smash those distorted thoughts, when you stop believing them, when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. Well, when I wrote that book, there were 10 or 15 cognitive therapists in the world, and almost everybody thought we were quacks. They weren't interested. They were so used to thinking you've got to take a medication if you're depressed. But after that book came out, researchers began to do research on it. This wasn't my research. This was independent researchers. And they said, what would happen if we just gave that book to people seeking treatment for depression at the medical center and said, you have to go on a waiting list for 4 weeks, but in the meanwhile, why don't you read this book? And they were shocked to discover that 2/3 of the people that they gave a copy of Feeling Good to recovered in 4 weeks with no other treatment, no pills, no psychotherapy, and no longer needed or wanted treatment. And then they've done long-term follow-up studies on those patients for 3 years to see that the improvements stick, and it did. They didn't relapse. They were feeling even better 3 years later. Well, that was phenomenal research because no antidepressant drug has been able to perform better than that. No form of psychotherapy has ever performed better than that, or probably even as well as the book Feeling Good. And so as a result, the book began selling and selling. Now it's sold over 5 million copies. It went to the top of all the bestseller lists. It's been translated into 30 languages, and cognitive therapy is now the most popular form of psychotherapy in the world. And cognitive therapy is considered the gold standard in the treatment of depression. And it's the most researched form of psychotherapy in the world. Well, so what's the new book, Feeling Great, about? Wasn't that good enough? Well, this is now 40 years later. I've had over 40,000 hours of therapy with people with the most severe depression and anxiety you can imagine, as well as mild problems. And I've had decades of research on how psychotherapy really works. And I've been trying to solve a problem that Freud tried to solve but failed, like resistance. Why do some people cling to their symptoms of depression and worthlessness and inadequacy or anxiety and panic, in spite of the fact that those symptoms make them create so much horrible pain and anguish? And maybe you've felt some of those symptoms at times. So you know what I'm talking about. And on the one hand, patients say, I want to get better, but then they seem to fight sometimes against recovery. And that's the 35% of people who didn't recover when they read my book. And I finally was able to solve that problem, to find out why people resist. And the answer is totally different from what you'd expect. And I've also developed in my group at Stanford powerful new techniques to antidote this thing called therapeutic resistance. So now the techniques are even more powerful. The cognitive techniques plus these new resistance busting or resistance melting techniques create a far more powerful approach. In fact, when I sit down with someone now, almost every time my patients recover in one session. It has to be a 2-hour therapy session, but I can generally complete a course of therapy now in one session. And if you told me this was possible 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said you were nuts, a con artist or whatever, but now I see that routinely. And that's what the new book is about, to share these new techniques with the world. I think it will be as big a breakthrough, if not a bigger breakthrough, than the cognitive revolution that was ushered in with my first book, Feeling Good. And here's the really cool thing. You know, on any given day, probably 50% of the people in America, they're not seriously depressed or anxious or suicidal, but aren't feeling happy. You're bummed out. You wonder if your career is amounting to anything. You're under pressure. You're under stress, or stress. You're beating up on yourself, and maybe you just need a little mental tune-up. And for those kinds of problems, the new techniques in Feeling Great are also fantastic, because the new goal is not just to get out of depression and anxiety and insecurity, but to feel tremendous joy, to get to the state that some people consider enlightenment. And it's a strong claim, but I can bring patients with me, if you like, really delightful people who can talk about their incredibly high-speed recovery from years of insecurity, years of angst. So that's what it's about, and thanks a lot, and I hope to have a chance to talk to you one of these days and tell you all about the exciting new developments.